On today's crossover episode with Locked On Wild, we talk Ryan Suter. We discuss Matt Dumba and what he can bring to the Dallas Stars, where the Wild are in their transition period, and plenty more next on Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Joey Erickson, former producer of 105 Through the Fan. Please be sure to subscribe. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast in on YouTube. And as always, thank you so much for making us a part of your day and making us your first listen. Happy Thursday, Stars fans. As promised, another crossover edition of Locked On Stars, this time with Seth over at Locked On Wild. Always a fun time catching up with Seth and talking Stars and Wild. Seth got to discuss where the Wild currently are in this little transition period, plus the emergence of Brock Faber and Marco Rossi, and what the future looks like for Minnesota. I asked Seth, what can Matt Dumba bring to the Dallas Stars? Because Matt Dumba, of course, spent most of his prime with Minnesota, so maybe we can get some of that Matt Dumba here with the Stars next season. And we touch on a little bit of everything and anything on today's episode, including Ryan Suter. I had to ask him about Suter, and now he has been bought out by a few teams within the Central Division. So a lot of fun as always. Don't want to keep you much longer. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Without further ado, crossover edition. Locked On Stars and Locked On Wild. Welcome to another special crossover edition for what I believe is the third time we have done one together. Locked On Stars and Locked On Wild. Seth, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. How have you been? How has the offseason treated you so far, my man?
Well, it's interesting because for the first time in my, adult working career on the job hunt. And so it's been a much less busy summer than I am used to, but in some ways it's been way more busy. So it's been an interesting kind of transition towards what comes next. And honestly, it's a perfect parallel to where the Minnesota Wild are at. Is we are kind of going to see this transition between what is currently taking place with this Wild team and where they would like to get to.
Yes.
And so transition, I think, is I think that's the perfect operative word for where I'm at and where the Minnesota Wild are at too. So I'm glad we're both going through this at the same time.
Yes, I have plenty of questions about that Minnesota Wild transition we'll get into. I'm sure you have plenty of questions for me and my Dallas Stars, and can't wait to dive into a little bit of everything on today's crossover episode. Should be a ton of fun. I'm going to get the hardest question out of the way, Seth. How happy are you that Ryan Suter is now being paid by multiple teams within the Central Division? Please, you have the floor.
Oh, it's crazy that we have gotten to this point and that it is a third Central Division team. And you are in a rare position to be able to kind of piggyback off of what I say next, because obviously we know the first buyout for Ryan Suter was motivated more by some of the stuff that was happening behind the scenes. I feel like it's safe to say the second buyout was related way more to what was happening on the ice.
Yes.
And so you've got Suter now being paid by the Wild, being paid by the Stars, and going to the St. Louis Blues. And I don't know about you, when I heard St. Louis was the team, I was like, huh.
Yeah, it did feel a bit odd.
It feels like a weird fit, not only for Ryan Suter, considering who's already on that blue line for St. Louis, but also where the St. Louis Blues are at. Like, Ryan Suter's getting up there in age.
Oh, yeah.
He has maybe, I don't know, based off of the contract that he got from the Blues, this might be it for him. And so you would think that he would want to hop into a team that is legitimately going to contend for a Stanley Cup. But you look at some of those teams that are going to be doing that, and I just don't know if there's a roster spot for a guy like that who doesn't really offer you a ton. And I don't know, it feels like there were it just feels like there were some other spots that maybe he
Yeah.
could have gone to. And I don't know, the fact that it was a Central Division team, I think, is a message at both the Stars and the Wild, but weird fit, to say
Yeah.
the least.
Yeah. I never thought he was going to have much of an issue finding another opportunity. I think a lot of teams could use a 39-year-old defenseman to just plug into their system. And the great thing about Ryan Suter this past season, at least for Dallas's sake, was he wasn't playing in the top four. They were finally able to get him into that third pairing, which actually was a nice fit for him. And I never had many concerns about Ryan Suter during his time here in Dallas. There was some obvious weaknesses. He wasn't as mobile as he once was, but I think he got a lot of flack for what I think was more of Dallas's fault than his own, because Dallas necessarily wasn't putting him in the best situations to be successful. Obviously, playing with Miro Heiskanen is going to help you out, but it also sort of forced Miro to have to elevate his play, or at least have to do a little bit more in order to cover up for Suter. This past season, with the emergence of Thomas Harley, really benefited the Dallas Stars. You could put Harley and Heiskanen together, and then Suter could just be on that third pair, and you kind of forget about him. And he was really good for most of the postseason. And he was the prior year as well. It was just the Western Conference Final, which was his demise in both of those series. And a lot of that is due to Dallas didn't have a lot of options this past year on the back end. If you recall, they were running 5 defensemen for the majority of the postseason. Then they finally found Petrovic, and that sort of worked, but Edmonton was just way too much for the Stars to handle, unfortunately. And yeah, Ryan Suter's 39 years of age at the end of the day. That's a that's an old man you're trying to try it out there and to get valuable minutes off of. So I just wanted to hear your take on Ryan Suter, since we certainly can relate to that. Alrighty, let's transition into the Minnesota Wild. I want to hear about post Dean Evison. I want to hear about this past regular season. From what I was kind of picking up, you were sort of you were on Team Tank a bit. Get the best draft pick possible, because the Wild were, I guess in my words, would have been consistently inconsistent, and that can be very frustrating. And it can also tease you a bit when they go on some runs and they keep it within distance of making the playoffs. Obviously, they came up a bit short this year. Yeah, take the floor. How would you describe this past season in Minnesota Wild history?
A roller coaster, to say the least. And I'm not talking about a roller coaster that operates under its normal conditions. I'm talking about a roller coaster that maybe breaks down or doesn't get up to the top of the hill and then is like, oh, well, now we're going to go backwards. Like, it felt like 3 different seasons all in one, because it's amazing that the Sweden trip was actually still this past season too. That feels like a season in and of itself. Then you have the slow start with Dean Evison being let go because the team just could not get any footing in the early part of the season. It was goaltending, it was special teams, and just not a great mix. And so then John Hines comes in, and like you said, the team goes on a run. I think tease is the perfect word, because at the end of the day, they beat the teams below them in the standings. But Dallas, Winnipeg, Colorado, even Nashville, you throw them in the mix too. 1 win against those teams.
Wow.
That just is not going to get it done, which is why I was of the belief that it was a situation in which you may want to try to get a look at what you have that is coming next. But the Wild continued to battle. They fought all the way to the end of the year. They found some things out. They figured out a couple of things that I think are intriguing going forward. John Hines employed the Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek line combination from February 7th to basically the end of the year. And it was one of the best lines in hockey. And so it wasn't a season in which you didn't get anything figured out. It just was a season in which it felt like the Wild were good enough to beat teams below them in the standings, but they were not good enough to beat the teams above them. And if you're going to be a playoff team, you got to beat the teams below you in the standings, but you have to, at minimum, be able to hold your own against those teams above you. And, you know, the better playoff team you are, the more able you are to get those wins against those teams. And it just never happens this past season. And so we go into the final year of Zach Parise and Ryan Suter kind of holding over this team with the dead cap hits. We go into this year with much of the same because there really wasn't flexibility to make a ton of moves this offseason. They did bring in Yakov Trenin, but beyond that, it's pretty much the same team. And the hope is a better start this year, which if you go better than 5-14, you put yourself in a better position to make the postseason. But as we'll talk about more later in the show, it feels like pretty much all the other teams in the Central Division got better.
Yeah. I think you can make the case for most of them. I don't know if I necessarily put Dallas into that conversation, but they didn't necessarily get worse in a lot of ways. I am curious when you say you learned a few things. If I had to assume, would that be Brock Faber is an absolute stud, and you're starting to see Marco Rossi sort of figure it out, and that's a really, really good thing for Wild fans.
Yeah, those were two of the biggest, most pleasant surprises of the season. We got a little taste of it last year for Brock Faber and in the postseason against the Dallas Stars.
Yeah.
He put it on full display this year, and the craziest part about it, and which is why I'm still just furiously bitter that he did not win the Calder Trophy. He played the final 2 months of the season.
You had no chance, Seth, man. That was Connor McDarid's ward all the way. Come on. We all knew that.
I know, but I'm still going to reserve my right to be upset. Faber played the entire final 2 months of the season with broken ribs. He didn't miss a game. He played, he was playing upwards of 25 minutes a night. He was playing on the power play, playing on the penalty kill. He was the top option defensively for the Wild. He didn't miss a beat. And so you see a guy who's capable of doing all of these things. You factor in the fact that he was significantly hurt. There's no way you don't come away just amazingly impressed with what he was able to do. And you talked about Marco Rossi too. One of only two players on the team, him and Faber, that played every game the entire season, all 82. They were the only two guys to do it. And Rossi, after a slow start to his career, that 19-game sample size 2 years ago that resulted in him having 1 point and being sent back down to Iowa, that's a distant memory. And now the question is like, well, geez, if we can get a couple of better players on the line with him, all of a sudden you're looking at a guy that is a top 6 staple in this lineup. And so those were definitely two of the big surprises. And we learned that those two are here to stay from an NHL perspective. And so that, like I said, it wasn't a year in which we just kind of advanced the calendar. There were still some things to take from this year that definitely are important going forward.
Yeah, it's huge, and Faber made an immediate impact since leaving the University of Minnesota. He stepped right in and was ready for this challenge, and it's also a good thing because with the cap situation and dealing with Parise and Suter, you need some of these young guys to pan out. So when you do have the cap space and mobility to go get guys, now you can start building around these young studs like Faber and Rossi. So I think the future is still very, very bright, but at the same time, they still have a chance to compete, man. They still have a chance to compete. And, speaking with Ann yesterday on Locked On Preds, one of the things she sort of pointed to was it was pretty big for Nashville to at least get into the postseason because they have some young guys that haven't had that experience. And now you bring in the Stamkoses and the Marchessaults who are serial winners. So they already have a taste for it. And that's something you can work with. And maybe Minnesota can do that here in the next couple of years. Maybe they want a 35-year-old Jamie Benn. I don't know. He's he's at the end of his contract next year, but may have to come back to that one at a later date. Anyways, let's move on to some more Stars and Wild discussions. The head-to-head matchups for next season, and what does the future look like for Dallas and Minnesota? We'll do that in just a moment. Today's episode of Locked On Stars and Locked On Wild, the special crossover edition, is brought to you by FanDuel. We all love sports. We love them so much, and you never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get such fewer games, and the sports aren't sporting like we want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep all of the sports going wherever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. It is free and available on your smartphone. It takes 30 seconds. Go to the Google Play Store, go to the App Store, and download FanDuel. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. We're in the dog days of summer. Major League Baseball is in full swing. Minnesota Twins are doing their thing, trying to get back into the postseason and make a splash. Not so much for the Texas Rangers, even though they're still fighting. They may be sellers at the deadline, but they're pushing as well. So head over to FanDuel and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So you did touch on it a bit, but I did want to ask you on the Minnesota Wild's off season. Not a whole lot. Pretty quiet for the most part, but Yakov Trenin was one of the big acquisitions at 4 years, $3.5 million. What do you make of Trenin, the player, and how do you like the fit? And does it look like he could maybe help that PK that's been a bit of an issue over the past few seasons?
It is interesting because I have, based off of previous moves, tried to take more of a case by case basis approach to particular players. And I like Trenin. He is, from what I've been told, just a complete bulldog, and he, I think, will help on the penalty kill for sure. The problem, though, is that it feels like the Minnesota Wild have a few of these guys that are all just the same sort of players. The identity guys that can help you out on the penalty kill. They're not going to score a ton of goals, but they're physical. And I feel like you should have a more limited number of those guys as opposed to making them a focal point on your lineup, because every team in the NHL, for the most part, is trying to prioritize speed and skill, but also having the ability to play physical when necessary. And it feels like the Minnesota Wild are kind of running opposite of that, where they play physical, and if needed, they can play with speed and skill. But the problem is you need that every game. And so it would be, if I was putting a roster together, I'd be looking more for the speed and skill guys. Now, this is where the prospects come in, we hope. But it felt like Bill Guerin felt like he couldn't do nothing. And so he goes out and gets a guy in Yakov Trenin that should help with what they're looking to do. But like I said, it feels like you've got 3 or 4 guys that fit this exact mold. They just haven't been able to do their thing at the level that they should. So it's a move by itself I don't have a problem with. Maybe a year too much for me, for my taste, and $3.5 million, that could be another discussion too.
Mm-hmm.
But it just feels like one of those things where it's like you see that meme of, hey mom, I want such and such, and well, we have such and such at home.
Yeah.
It's like, I want Yakov Trenin. Well, we have Yakov Trenin at home.
We have 3 of them actually.
Yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. But it does feel like Bill Guerin kind of thought, well, I can't do nothing.
That's a great way to put it, because I think Jim Nill felt a little of the same way when July 1st was rolling and they weren't able to go out and get some of those big fishes, possibly like the Matt Roys of the world, the Brandon Montours, which they would have never been in the same stratosphere of some of those deals, even though the Roy one wasn't in particular too crazy of a deal term and money wise. And I think that's why they sort of went into panic mode and they just went out and sort of cleaned up the other right shot defensemen that were on the market in Matt Dumba and Labushkin and Brendan Smith, who are okay players. It just, I think it was below the expectations of what many Stars fans had, including myself. I was hoping for a bit of a splash to try to replace Chris Tanev, who was wonderful here in Dallas. And I think that meme can sort of be thrown back on the Stars. And, well, we had Ryan Suter. Why would you buy out Ryan Suter to go sign Dumba and Labushkin? Where it's like, well, we kind of have that at home to some degree. But I am curious, and I have to ask you about Matt Dumba, because he really found himself in Minnesota and sort of played his prime years with the Wild. What is Dallas getting in Matt Dumba? I'm not necessarily in love with the player, and I'm certainly not in love with where they're going to have him, and that's going to be in the top 4 playing quality minutes. But if I asked you from an unbiased perspective, what is the ceiling you could possibly get with Dumba, and what do you think his floor is right now? Because he still is relatively young in hockey years at 30 years of age.
It's interesting because the player that was drafted by the Minnesota Wilds, that Matt Dumba, was one who was way more of an offensive defenseman than a defensive guy. And he was always known for his shots. He was great on the power play. But obviously, and I forget which Kachuk brother it was, but there was a fight between him and one of them in which he tore a pec muscle, and his career just completely flipped after that. His shot wasn't the same. He wasn't able to produce at the same level that he did previously, and it was a very high level of performance that he was able to bring to the table. He had at one point, I think it was something like 14 goals in 30 games in one season. So a guy that's really capable of putting up some high point totals, but he just has not been the same guy since that injury. And we saw it in Minnesota near the end of his tenure, is a guy who I think figured out the other way to be an NHL defenseman by being, more of a physical guy. And obviously that was seen in the series against the Dallas Stars from 2 seasons ago. But you see what he did with Arizona and then Tampa Bay this past season, and it's just a guy that I think is still kind of trying to figure out what he is now. We got a little taste of it, but I think he's still trying to figure out how to do that over the course of a full 82 game season. With the defenseman that Dallas has, obviously you've got some really good top end guys. So it's a possibility where I think he can be sheltered, much like he was here in Minnesota, being longtime pairing partner with Jonas Brodin, who's one of the best there is. So he was able to shelter those defensive deficiencies. But, much like Suter, the offensive upside just really isn't there anymore. Yeah. And so it's all about what he brings to the table defensively. And if he can figure out how to just, not be a liability defensively, it could work.
Yeah, I'm hoping he does find his game a bit here. And I'm trying to save some of my critiques for when the season begins, because who knows, it could be a really nice fit. But he has gone into some penalty trouble after the last few seasons. I think he's had over 80 minutes the last 3 years. But also where he was playing in Arizona and some other places, that could change here in Dallas. It's obviously a much better environment for him to be successful. Don't necessarily love him probably being in the top 4, but as you mentioned, if you pair him with a Harley or Heiskanen, it may shelter him a bit and maybe turns out to be a really nice player. And then, I'm sitting here, eating crow a bit, which I would certainly love to do. And Dallas can be in a position to make a deep playoff run. I guess where really my frustrations lie is it just doesn't feel like Dallas got over the hump. It just doesn't feel like these were the acquisitions to get them over the hump of the Western Conference Final. And I still think they're a trade deadline away from doing that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You position yourself and then you go find another Chris Tanev. And then maybe you're feeling pretty good about where you lie. What does the near future from your perspective look like for the Wild? Because there are a lot of great pieces. Kirill's going to do his thing. Boldy is a heck of a player as well down the middle. What does it look like for Minnesota? And are you would you say you're pretty bullish on their chances the next what would you say 5 years of kind of getting back in the mix?
I'm bullish on their chances long term, but there is some work that needs to be figured out between now and then, particularly on offense, because it's a team that, once we saw that Joel Eriksson, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Boldy combination, the rest of the scoring in the lineup just vaporized. And so it's a team that needs just some young pop that can be added into the lineup, similar to what the Stars got with Logan Stankoven and, even going back a couple of years, Wyatt Johnston. What a monster he has turned into. The Wild need players like that to be injected into this lineup. Second line wing in the combination of Matt Zuccarello and Marco Rossi has been a real point of contention for me, in that Marcus Johansson occupied that spot for a good portion of the season, but it feels like he was just a placeholder there. I think you could insert pretty much any player into that spot and get 20 goals just by default, and he ended up with 11 on the season, and 6 of those were or one of those was on the power play. So 10 even strength goals from a second line guy, that's not enough. Mm-hmm. And so you've got prospects like Liam Ogren, you've got Danila Yurov, you've got Riley Heights that are going to be making this team over the next few years. It really feels like a situation with this Minnesota Wild team is, they're pretty limited right now in terms of being able to compete for a playoff spot. But over the next couple of years, as these players get accustomed to the lineup, they're good enough that I think this Wild team has some real good upside to add pieces around Kirill and to just further that mix. It's just a matter of getting them there. We're in that, like I said, we're in kind of that transition where once you get those guys into the lineup, then some of these questions will be answered. And then you get to the point where you can really start to pinpoint exact areas that need to be improved. And so we're in just this like middle ground. We're in like the waiting room in the lobby of the doctor's office or wherever, just waiting for the number to be called. And so the Wilds can expedite that process a little bit, or they opt on the side of caution, and you continue to see what we've seen play out over these last couple of years.
Yeah, get off to a better start. Those first 20 games are very, very important. If they get off to a better start, who knows what will happen. And the Central will be interesting because there obviously is a lot of good teams. I mean, the West too. You got to think about the wild card positions. Could Vegas sort of fall back? Could some other teams fall back? And Minnesota sort of is that next team up, and maybe can find themselves back into the playoff conversation. Speaking of the Central Division, I do have a few more questions with you about the Minnesota Wild, so I'll do that on the other side too. But we'll talk about the gauntlet that the Central and West is every single year, and where we see the Wild and Stars finishing at the end of next season. We'll do that in just a moment. So my lingering Minnesota Wild question I still have. Goaltending was a bit of an issue at the beginning of last season, especially with Fleury and Gustafsson. But those aren't the two I want to talk about. I want to talk about Wellstad a bit.
Sure.
I don't think the Wild did him many favors making his debut in Dallas when the Stars walloped them. But he came back, if I'm not mistaken, and had a bit better finish to the season. But what do you make out of him? Do you still think of him as he's going to be your future number one netminder? No, Nashville is also dealing with a bit of this in this farm system. I think he's still a great prospect, but I'd love to know a bit more about him after that game in Dallas, because that was not very pretty for his sake, and not much of his fault either.
No, that was a like perfect storm bad scenario. There were injuries in the lineup, and it just felt like if they would have played him the game before,
yes,
it would have been a fundamentally different conversation that we would have been having about kind of where he's at. But he more than bounced back in his next couple of starts. Had a shutout against, yes, I know it's the San Jose Sharks, but it still counts as a shutout. So
Stars took them to the overtime like twice.
They were a weird team this year.
Yes,
I just could never figure them out. It felt like it felt like they should have been way worse than they were, but at some points it's like, how can you be this bad? But Jesper bounced back. He had the shutout against the I think it was the Chicago Blackhawks, now that I think of it, but he still performed really well, and he still is the future guy for this Minnesota Wild franchise. They're just in an odd spot with their goalie situation because you brought back Marc-Andre Fleury for one more season, and I don't know. That would not have been my preference either. I mean, we're getting a pretty clear picture as to why I'm sitting here and I'm not in the GM's chair for this team, but it just felt like the way to go for this team was Philip Gustafsson and Jesper Wallstedt as your goalie tandem for this upcoming season, because Gus is still a young guy. He is a year removed from being one of the best goalies in the league. I think the league just got a little bit of a book on him this past season, and now it's on him to make the adjustments to try to get back to that level previously. But the Wild want to give Jesper the opportunity to be mentored by Marc-Andre Fleury for a full season, to pick his brain after every start, to see his process, because Marc-Andre Fleury has been a goalie for a very long time in this league. He has had some incredible seasons as a netminder. He has also had some seasons in which he has had to overcome a good deal of adversity. And so the Wild want to have Jesper mentor him, but I feel like there may have been a little different way to go about that than putting another young goalie just on the block to make a move. Now, to the Wild's credit, they haven't made that move yet, but it just feels like writing on the wall it's coming, because are you really going to send Jesper to Iowa for another season? Is he going to get anything out of that?
Yeah.
Feels like a no from me to that answer, to answer that question, but we're in this weird spot where it feels like there are a few things that need to be fleshed out. The season will be getting going in October, and so do you do that here before the end of August? Do you do that in August?
Yeah,
I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. That seems to be what the kind of system is here at this time at the end of July. We'll just wait and see. Training camp will get rolling, and then a lot of things will start to figure themselves out. I did ask this to one of my guests a few weeks ago. I want to ask it to you as well. You look at the 8 teams that made the playoffs in the Western Conference last year: Dallas, Winnipeg, Vancouver, Colorado, Edmonton, Nashville, LA, and then Vegas, who was not an 8th seed, by the way. Out of those teams, who misses the playoffs next season? Who do you think jumps in?
I'll start with who jumps in, because it feels like it's got to be Nashville. It feels like it's got to be them to hop in at this point. Honestly, just because of the way that they are kind of trending, I am going to say that the Los Angeles Kings are the team, and I should have looked at this before I said that, because Nashville did make the postseason last year.
No worries.
I feel like the Los Angeles Kings are the team that is really on the bubble here
Mm-hmm.
to potentially miss the postseason. But it's interesting because you look at the other teams that didn't. St. Louis very clearly transitioning
Yeah.
towards kind of a rebuild. Calgary's in one. Seattle is hoping that they have a much better season this year. Utah,
Could be interesting. Another aggressive team.
Utah,
Well,
I'm going to use a football term that
yeah.
one of my favorite football analysts used to talk about teams that could make the postseason if enough things go right. Possibly frisky.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Utah is possibly frisky, and then Anaheim, Chicago, San Jose. Of
Yeah.
those three, it feels like Chicago is the closest, but still probably a little far away. And so it feels like that top 8 is pretty set.
That's what I kind of got out of it. But at the same time, and this guest pointed back to me, it's more about who's going to regress probably
Yes.
than who's going to make the jump up, right?
Yep.
And that's where you're thinking, if even St. Louis, they're going through a weird period, but they were only missed by 6 points. I mean, there's not much of a worry about them maybe competing Minnesota again as a team. I don't really see Calgary being in that mix, but yeah, that's kind of what I came out. Man, it feels like the same 8
Yeah.
again, but probably a team will regress, and I think LA could be that, and Vegas too. It was for the first kind of free agency period, they just kind of stood pat, which was really interesting, and maybe some of those crazy deals and constantly going for it maybe caught up to them a bit, and maybe they have a bit of a down year, but at the same time, who knows? It really is stacked there. But I mean, you look at the top of the division, and I mean, most of those teams you would think are going to stay there, like your Dallas and Colorado and Winnipeg. So I think when you look at teams like the Wild and Blues, can you sneak into that 7 or 8 spot? But as you alluded to earlier, you have to beat those playoff teams a bit. You got to beat those playoff teams. And the Stars are a bit in that boat too. They had to beat the Colorado and Winnipegs of the world, albeit for very different reasons. But if they wanted to win the Central, if they wanted to win the West and get home ice advantage, which doesn't even matter because Pete DeBoer can't win game 1 at home. But I digress.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out because of those teams that could potentially jump up, how aggressive are you? If you have a lot of things go right this season, like how much do you take advantage of that? Because you hit it right on the head. I feel like it's more likely that one of those top 8 just has nothing go right to where they fall out of it. And you've got somebody maybe rising above them to take a spot.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be fascinating because I feel like there still are a bunch of things that need to be resolved for a great handful of teams. And so do we get a busy August? I would be fine with that, but it feels like there is a lot that still needs to be resolved before the season gets going.
It'll be a lot of fun to watch it unfold. This past NHL season was a good one. It was really good in the grand scheme of things. So hopefully the sequel can be just as good. Well, Seth, always a pleasure to hop on with you. It's been a lot of fun getting to do these over the past couple of years. Please share with the audience where they can find you and your wonderful Locked On Wild show. And shout yourself out a little bit and share your platforms.
You can just search Locked On Wild. And, we had grand designs on doing like prospect week this week, taking a look at the organization, prospects to watch, stuff like that. But with Dean Evison getting hired in Columbus and a couple of other crossovers being lined up, it's turned more into crossover week, which, hey, I'm totally fine with that. And it's just about at this point, just kind of starting to switch the message to this upcoming season as opposed to kind of looking back or looking way ahead. August is when we're going to start to finally get full steam into 2024, 2025 is coming. So listeners can tune in for everything that we have to offer. Nice part is all the socials are just at Locked On Wild. So nice and easy for you to find them all. But we just continue to roll through the hits here as we move towards the end of the month of July.
Absolutely. Well, be sure to sauce me and Seth a subscribe on Locked On Wild, Locked On Stars. Well, hit that like button, hit that notification bell as well. Never miss an episode of Locked On Stars or Locked On Wild. Shout out to all you everydayers out there that are rocking along with us this off season. We're trying to keep it fresh, trying to keep it entertaining. It can be it can be a bit wonky sometimes, but these crossovers have been fun. It's sort of been a crossover week as well. We had Ann over at Locked On Preds, so a lot of fun. And the more we can do this as shows, I think the better. I think it keeps everybody on their toes. Well, that'll do it for this crossover episode of Locked On Stars, Locked On Wild. You can find us on our respective shows tomorrow. Until then, so long, everybody.